Spring has finally arrived in the UK, which means I can get my folding bench out in the garden for the first time this year. It also means it is time to start sowing some seeds for the garden. Now, I've made a few garden related projects on my channel over the last year. The most well received one was my garden obelisk I made last spring, and this build is for my wife, who is a real keen gardener. As well as aiming this video at my fellow woodworkers, I have tried to be a little bit more inclusive and not purely use tools that cost hundreds of pounds. Or in the commentary, I've discussed alternative methods. Here I'm using my trusty Irwin tenon saw to cut the materials down to length. If you don't have a square to hand, one little cheat is to use the corner of a hardback book. I find Jamie Oliver works best. And if you don't have a saw, you could always channel your inner woodworking ninja. Once I had all my components cut out, the next task was to mark out the slope on the sides. Here I'm marking out a slope from 100mm to 200mm. It is possible, but maybe not desirable, to make the rip cut across the slope with the tenon saw. Cutting the corner off the other piece was far easier. This is how the end will look after cutting. Now, just to bling up your tongue and groove flooring boards, I like to put a V on with the block plane, but this is not necessary. The reason I use tongue and groove boarding is almost half the price of joinery grade softwoods. And when you come to joining it together, like I'm doing here, gluing up, the tongue and groove makes it really easy. Here I'm gluing up the two end panels with my glue bars I built a few weeks ago. Because if you've not got clamps, then a few pieces of timber and wedges can go a long way. And once I glued up the sides, I now turn my attention to the rear panel. And after 2 hours in the sun, these were ready for the next stage. Back in the workshop, I cut the slope on the other side with my Festool saw. I then offered the two up together to ensure they was the same size. The one that I cut with my tenon saw would just benefit from a run over with the smoothing plane, so I mounted it in my bench bowl and then just ran the smoothing plane down 3 or 4 times to smooth out the edge. Now I need to consider the base. For this I'm going to use 6mm plywood. There are a few choices of fixing the panel to the base. One way is just to screw the panel straight to the bottom. I did consider using my grooving blade to make the groove to accept the bottom, or even doing it on the router table. But in the end, I elected to cut one side of the groove away. This would create a rebate in which I could sit the 6mm ply panel. So I reversed my saw out of its parking space. We've added sound effects. Remove the crown guard and the riving knife, and lowered the blade to just a few millimeters so it would remove 1/2 of the groove. And now I had the base taken care of, I needed to cut my front and back panel to height whilst also adding the slope of the sides. To ensure I had the saw blade set at the correct angle, I used the slope on one of the sides. And then reattached my crown guard and riving knife, put on my PPE and made the cut. Just check that the size was correct before resetting the fence to cut the front panel. And then put the saw back in its parking space. Sometimes the roof truss webs come in really handy, and here they work perfectly as I screwed the frame together. It did dawn on me as I was putting this together that it might not go out of the loft arch, so just to check before I went any further. The next task was to fit the base, so I measured the size and then made my cut with my Festool track saw. The base is just screwed in dry. I didn't want to glue this together as I may need to take it apart for storage during the winter. And then to finalise, I just removed the sharp edges with my block plane and gave the whole thing a quick sanding. Now these Seed Tray Tampers should be the easiest project going. Basically they're just two pieces of wood, but as you'll see I did add a little bit of intricacy to the project. I made two bases from offcuts of inch by 6 and inch by 4. Roughly marked the corners to coincide with the rounds on the corners of the seed tray and then took them to my belt sander and trimmed off the corners to suit. Checked that they was a decent fit and then just finally sanded them with my DeWalt sander. Now here's where the project got a little bit more tricky. I had this little maple log that my dog brought back from a walk a couple of years ago. It had been sat in the workshop for a while. So on the bandsaw I performed a small logging exercise. Roughly cut the log in half and then using the fence to guide created two small planks. And then I added a sacrificial fence to the bandsaw so I could use the longer length to straighten the planks up against. What I did next was genius. Unfortunately, it's gone unrecorded because I didn't start the camera. Only kidding, I actually just glued the two pieces together. And then made a small heart-shaped template from a piece of paper. To cut this out on the bandsaw, I needed to swap to my narrowest blade, performing my bandsaw coiling trick in the process. It would have been far easier to cut this with a 1/4 inch blade. I only had a 3/8 blade, so I had to make small sequential cuts just to get round the curve. Now it doesn't happen very often, but here I really wish I had some finer tools to do this, so I had to make the best with a carpenter's chisel and my tenon saw. I actually fancy doing some wood carving, but I don't really know where to start, so if you have any suggestions, drop me a comment. So what followed here was lots and lots of sanding, first on the Triton machine, and then with my DeWalt sander, and finally by hand. I've spared you 95% of it. I actually use very little hardwood in the loft. Hardwood just seems to be much finer and it gets everywhere. In the end I got fed up holding a small piece of wood, so at this point I decided to fix it to the base, to make it easier to hold and to sand. For the connection I cut a mortise pocket right in the centre of the base. I then glued the handle into it. And once the handle is set I spent a lot more time sanding it to the final finish, but I saved you the pain of having to watch that. To finish, I gave it a coat of quick drying varnish. And as for the box, I gave it a couple of coats of cuprinol that I paint everything else that's in the garden. Of course, the day I finally came to use it, the British weather had changed and we'd gone from spring back into winter. So instead of sowing my seeds in the sunshine, I had to take shelter in the conservatory.